So before Thanksgiving, if anybody can remember anything that long ago, it does feel like a long time ago now, we were talking about Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, should have become Queen of England, was for a time Queen Consort of France, while she was married to Francis II of France before he died. She returned, I mentioned that after Francis II died, she returned to Scotland, where she was to be queen, and she found herself incessantly harassed by the machinations and the secret plots fomented by the gold of Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was hiring people to either to try to assassinate her or otherwise undermine her and give her general difficulty. Also, before I forget, the next quiz, I'll have yet to determine whether it'll be the final one or not. I don't think there'll be any time after it. But the church history quiz, most likely the last one, will be Thursday of next week. So a week from tomorrow. Right, so I'll get to the study guide as soon as possible. All right, so Mary again, her first spouse Francis II had died, so she married Henry Darnley, and found who actually turned out to be a traitor, though he himself died not long after. He was not the protector of the queen that he should have been. So really only a minor character in the grand scheme of things. She got tired of Scotland, actually. Mary Stuart did. Tired of all of the trouble that was being caused by all these assassinations and everything. Because it turns out, actually, this Henry Darnley was assassinated by somebody else who wanted to marry Mary. Though, again, this is why there's a canon law to the effect that you cannot marry someone whose spouse you have murdered. It cannot validly, even let alone any question of laicity, it's not even valid. To prevent things like this. So she got tired of living in a kingdom where the throne was swimming in blood. So she decided to take refuge in England and accordingly placed her life and liberty in the hands of Elizabeth, which in retrospect was a mistake. But given the situation of Scotland at the time, you could see why she wanted to do it. But, as we know, England only gave her the hospitality of prison. Upon hearing of this gross violation of international law, forget about the obligations of charity or of the reverence due to a monarch, also of international law, Pius V, again we're in the reign of Pius V here, published a solemn sentence of excommunication against Elizabeth. So St. Pius V was very much angered by this horrible treatment of Mary Stuart. He said in his bull that considering that princess, meaning Elizabeth, has throughout all England usurped the title and authority of supreme head of the church, that she has abolished the ancient and true worship restored by Mary, that means Mary Tudor, the lawful queen, that she has, no. Well, of course, Mary Tudor did restore it, but then Mary Stuart should be the queen. So it's actually a little ambiguous which Mary he's referring to here. But basically, anybody is more legitimate than Elizabeth. That's the point. Mary Stuart should be, Mary Tudor was, and did things more correctly, at least certainly in principle. If there are any excesses, that's another story, but certainly in principle, she did everything correctly. But he says, abolish the ancient and true worship restored by Mary. That's referring to the actions of Mary Tudor. But then he says the lawful queen, yes, she was, obviously, but then also now Mary Stuart should be. So he seems as referring to Mary Tudor, but Mary Stuart should be the queen. That she has forbidden the prelates, the clergy, and the people to acknowledge the Roman Church, to obey its laws and canonical sanction, that he has imprisoned the faithful bishops and clergy and put many of them to death by tortures, which we're currently hearing about in the refectory, that she still persists in her course of cruel violence, refusing to receive the apostolic nuncios sent by us to England. So again, by us meaning by himself. Again, popes always use the royal we. In other words, they use the plural in the place of the singular, and the first person to refer to themselves. Monarchs, typically, it's why it's called a royal. It's a thing that royalty does. So the Pope being, of course, the vicar of Christ on earth, but then also at this time, of course, head of the temporal ruler, the king, really, of the states, of the papal states. Many reasons to use that. Just to be clear, he says, "We, therefore, declare that she has forfeited," meaning Elizabeth, "every claim to that kingdom, and we hereby absolve her nobles, subjects, and people from their allegiance." Again, it used to be that popes could absolve subjects from their allegiance to their monarchs because, remember, in the feudal system, everything was based upon oaths of fidelity, oath of fealty, rather, of a vassal to his liege lord. And remember, those who received oaths of fealty from those beneath them could themselves be considered the vassals of someone higher. In fact, monarchs, and it was something that was done when the world was Catholic, and especially in the High Middle Ages, that monarchs would actually present their entire kingdoms to the Pope and say, here's my entire kingdom, and I swear fealty to the Pope, and I give my kingdom to the Pope, and then he would give it back to the monarchs to rule over as fiefdoms, essentially. Of course, the Pope wasn't going to administer all of the kingdoms of Europe himself, obviously. Those monarchs continued to rule over them, but it was very much symbolic. I mean, it wasn't like it meant nothing. They truly were submitted to the Roman Pontiff, but it was very much an act of a very public act of submission to the Holy See. And so again, everything being based on those oaths of fealty, the ecclesiastical authority being able to dispense with oaths that are taken. The Pope had the authority to dispense, say, an entire kingdom if the monarch was misbehaving. Say, all right, all of your subjects, they're all absolved from their oaths of fealty. Nobody has to listen to you anymore. You have no more authority. Although, again, interestingly, that it was the horrible treatment of Mary Stuart that made him angry in the first place, but Pius V made no mention in this particular document of the disgraceful treatment of Mary Stuart, lest his words should only aggravate, instead of lessening, the sufferings of the captive queen. So he does this to try to make things better for her, but doesn't state that because the obvious response to that on the part of Elizabeth would be, well, let's just make it worse then. That would be her initial response to that. And the bull was a signal for fresh persecutions in England, and as you would expect, the captivity of Mary Stuart still became became still more rigorous. So again, it had the opposite effect of what was hoped for, but clearly Elizabeth deserved excommunication. And there's no question of that. This is absolutely disgusting. Though her cousin, Elizabeth, did not dare, so Mary's cousin, did not dare yet perpetrate the regicide. In other words, she didn't want to actually kill Mary Stuart. That might be going too far for the other monarchs of Europe who could give her significant military trouble. She doubtless feared the indignation of Europe and did not yet feel powerful enough to set it at defiance. So she's excommunicated, and Pius V declares her subjects absolved from their allegiance, but she doesn't want to take the still further step of killing Mary Stuart. So at this time, the monarch who is showing the greatest zeal for the maintenance of the Catholic faith in Europe is Philip II of Spain. And also remember, at this time, the Netherlands were part of the Habsburg Empire. Philip II, of course, is ruling over them currently, having received them by the will of his father, Charles V, which were, by their geographical situation and their neighborhood to Germany and France, naturally exposed to the twofold contagion of Lutheranism and Calvinism. Remember, you have ongoing revolutions in Germany, started by Luther, of course, initially. Of course, he's dead by now, but his movement, which of course continues to this day, is very much still in force there. You have the wars of religion, Calvinism invading France. So you have the Netherlands, which are close to both of those countries, being infected with the contagion spreading from those places where the heresy is spreading. So Philip had entrusted the government of those states, of the Netherlands, to his sister Margaret, Duchess of Parma, to whom he assigned the Cardinal Granvelle, Bishop of Arras, as prime minister. So this cardinal was one of those who gets into a high position like that for having considerable administrative skills, because according to Darras, he allowed no obstacle to stand in the way of his designs. So then, in order to try to bring the whole situation under control, this Cardinal Granvelle, along with Margaret, Duchess of Parma, they grant certain concessions to the Calvinists, which I'm not going into detail here, but there were still many Calvinist partisans among the people, which continued to spread the spirit of revolt, the spirit of discord and revolution. It was at the time, though, brooding, the revolt still in silence and secrecy. In other words, they were still more or less in the planning stages. They were still trying to bring things about, even if it hadn't come to flare up yet. The Council of Regency was still, so at this time, was called upon to decide whether the acts of the Council of Trent should be promulgated in the Netherlands. So, of course, the cardinal uses all his influence to secure an affirmative decision. Because remember, that did have to happen. The monarchs had to promulgate these documents in their own countries. That they had to be published, so people actually know that these things were happening. And in fact, there were certain legalities attached to it. Like sometimes, if that happened later on, but the suppression of the Jesuits was considered not to have taken place in certain countries where the bull was not published. People were just never notified of that. And actually, popes themselves used that because it was something that was, and this is in the future, so we'll see it later. Next year, I believe, is the year we see that. But in any case, the Jesuits were suppressed by one pope. He didn't want to, but he suppressed them because so many monarchs were demanding it. But enough other monarchs didn't want it to happen that they never published the bulls in their territories, and so a lot of the Jesuits just ignored it. And so later on, a pope after that basically said, okay, we can turn a blind eye to that because the bull was never published there. It never happened. So again, there was definitely, this had to happen, that these documents had to be published. I mean, it's not to say that a definition of a dogma of the faith could be considered, you didn't have to give assent to it in some area, but these documents did have to be published. And it would be considered an act of defiance to not do it. But also, again, certain disciplinary measures would be considered not to take effect if those were not published. So the Calvinists seize this occasion to display their hatred against him. Again, that they hate him is no surprise, but that he is now doing everything in his power to make sure that the decrees of Trent are promulgated is going too far for them. Now they break out into open revolt. So William, Prince of Orange, who's the stadtholder, again, that the word is stadtholder. That was the name of his position. William of Orange. Prince William of Orange. He was the Stadtholder of Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht. Also the Count of Egmont, Stadtholder of Flanders and Artois, along with maybe one or two others. So they have formed a league against the cardinal. Now there's an open revolt against the Habsburgs and the Church in the Netherlands. So the Protestants, at the same time, published a confession of faith, preceded by a letter, in which they represented to the king, in other words, they expressed to him, that as faithful subjects, they had hitherto paid their taxes. So they're saying, we've been very good up until now, so congratulating themselves to the king on how faithfully they've paid their taxes. Which was, of course, indirectly threatening the king. So in other words, if we don't, if you're at least reading between the lines, but if we don't get what we want now, we're not doing that anymore. That's the idea. And then they had also begun to make open demonstrations against the regent, so against Margaret. Margaret is the regent, the cardinal is the prime minister of her administration. Margaret was alarmed at this. She's the actual, technically the ruler of those areas. She requested that Philip withdraw the cardinal, Cranvel. The king refused, and the Confederates retired from the Council of State. So those rebelling against the Habsburgs now, they retire from the Council of State until the urgent requests of Margaret obtained the recall of the minister. So he was finally withdrawn in 1564 because he was too much of an enemy to the Protestants. So in itself, unfortunate that a strong somebody who's very much fighting for the rights of the legitimate ruler, for one thing, of the Netherlands, but also for that the teachings of the Church be promulgated in that area according to all of the required methods should be removed was a shame, but they saw it as the only way to get the Protestants to stop acting up. So he was withdrawn again in 1564. So the majority of the council voted in favor of adopting the decrees of Trent, even with that. And Philip, to whom the votes had been sent, ordered that the penalties decreed against heretics should be carried out in all their rigor. So Philip II is not happy with these people either, for multiple reasons. For one thing, he's a devout Catholic, and also he's the ruler of the area. So he hates the heresy that's infecting the area for both of those reasons. Because once again, heresy is incredibly disruptive, not only to the church, but also to the civil order. And this is yet another example. If all the examples of Luther and Huss and all of those heretics from earlier, either past centuries or the current one we're studying, the 16th century, if all of that was not enough, then we have this current example of problems in the Netherlands because of the infection of heresy. So the royal ordinance gave new pretext to the malcontents, whom William of Orange directed with, let's check exactly what they're talking about here. But anyway, he's in charge of all of these malcontents. He's the one who's really coordinating all their efforts. So remember, he is also a son-in-law of Coligny, who is one of the Calvinists fighting in France. And also, like him, closely bound to the cause of the Huguenots. Remember, the Huguenots are the French Calvinists who were fighting to take over France. So on the 16th of February of 1565, a dozen noblemen, under the influence of William of Orange, signed the Compact or Compromise of Breda, which demanded a redress of grievances. So, in other words, they're demanding more concessions. So, within a few months, this league that's being formed against Philip II, and or initially was formed against the Cardinal Cranvel, but now is also, of course, continuing its revolutions against Philip II, numbered 400 gentlemen who placed themselves and their arms at his service. So that's I just talked about. A lot of this is really secular history, but we're still at a time when church and state, or at least in Catholic countries, are still united as they're supposed to be. So a lot of this does pertain to, we're talking about the spread of heresy here. That definitely is of interest to the church. So again, a lot of this, though, we don't have to cover in so much detail. So again, in April of the same year, 1565, 250 of these, of 250 gentlemen came to Brussels to present a petition to Margaret. So they're making their demands known to the regent herself. She wrote to Philip, acquainting him with the demands of the Confederates, in the meantime suspending the edicts of which they complained. So they're really causing a lot of trouble. Remember, she had him recall the cardinal in the first place because they were complaining about him. Let's see. So again, these rebels, or actually, in this case specifically, the petitioners were called began to be called the beggars around this time, les gueux, the French word for it. And again, one of the lords in Margaret's court began to refer to them as that around this time. But they seized upon that immediately, and the word became a party appellation, which they were proud to bear. So they started calling themselves that. And so then the Calvinists began to rise up in all directions. They plundered and profaned more than 400 churches in the provinces of Brabant and Flanders alone, and their error was everywhere established by force of arms. So they're really going crazy now. So Margaret, in response, raised forces to fight them, recaptured some cities. They'd taken Valenciennes and Cambrai, subjected the turbulent people of Antwerp, restored the royal authority with the Catholic religion in all the revolted provinces. So she first tries through diplomacy, tries granting them concessions, has Cardinal Cranvel recalled, but now just decides to deal with them through force of arms because there's no other way. So they do that, and then the rebels only found their safety in flight. So after that, things were apparently calm in the Netherlands, but the revolt was still actually fermenting. It's beneath the surface. It's not so overt anymore, but it's still there, still fermenting. And the successive emigrations of whole communities, large numbers of people, impoverished the country. So people started leaving because they saw that they can't be heretics openly in this country, so they decided to leave those areas. Philip was satisfied, so he thought, that force alone could protect the majesty of religion and of the throne, which had openly been outraged by the rebels. So he thought he could keep them under control by force of arms alone, but not necessarily. The Duke of Alva was made a generalissimo, So in other words, somebody to command all of the military forces in that area. And ordered to the Netherlands with an army of 20,000 men, whereupon Margaret resigned her authority to him. So the Duke of Alva, and that's Duke of Alva is now regent of the Netherlands. He entered Brussels in August of 1567, and soon after that, two of the prominent members of the League that was formed against the legitimate authority, and really also against the faith, against the Catholic faith, were arrested and put to death in June of 1568. So the Duke of Alva is bringing things under control, making examples of some of the leaders of these revolts. And the same sentence actually included William of Orange, the Prince of Orange, but he had taken precautions to place himself outside of the reach of the punishment which awaited him. So he hid himself. It's not exactly clear what exactly he did, whether he hid himself or went to another country or something, but he made it impossible for that to be carried out against him, although he was sentenced to death for his part in the rebellion. And there was even a royal commission called the Council of Tumults that was appointed to bring the punishment of the authors of those troubles. So, Council of Tumults, dealing with the tumults. And then, and this pertains more to secular history, or to more the biography of Philip II himself. But he actually had trouble with his son, or one of his sons, Don Carlos. And Darius gives a whole long letter that Philip II wrote to St. Pius V. It's basically talking about how terrible this is, that his son is causing him so much trouble. We don't need to go through all of that. But so Philip II actually had to even imprison him to make sure that he didn't cause any more trouble. And actually, he had plotted against the life of Philip II. So he was planning to kill his father and also his king. So very bad. So he ended up being arrested by the Duke of Feria, who was the captain general of the guards, and tried by the Council of Castile, although Darius says not by the tribunal of the Inquisition, as some historians erroneously assert. He was arraigned on the charge of high treason, and the judgment was pronounced according to the laws of the kingdom and condemned to suffer capital punishment. And it doesn't say that he actually did, but he was condemned to that, which is not unreasonable for plotting against the life of a king. To be condemned to death for that is not unreasonable. And then, that's what's going on in the Habsburg Empire at this time, in Spain and the Netherlands specifically. And so now we'll turn back to actions that the popes take to prevent the spread of Islam into Europe. So the popes were always the first to appreciate the fact that the destruction of Turkish power was really a question of life and death for Europe. Certainly, whenever they got their aggressive sultans like Suleiman II, who was living around this time, also known, at least among Turks, as Suleiman the Magnificent, because he was such a conqueror. And also Selim II, who was his son. And with these particular sultans, their progress became more alarming than ever. Although, by all accounts, this was like the height, the peak of Turkish power, of the spread of their empire and of their military ability. And it was after that that they began the slow decline into becoming what was eventually known as the sick man of Europe. In other words, a weak, crumbling empire that was other powerful nations, other powerful empires nearby started taking chunks of. And in fact, that's what led to the, at least was among the immediate causes of the First World War, was the Austrian Empire swallowing up bits of what had been the Turkish Empire. But yeah, that's many centuries in the future. Right now, the Turks are still at their basically at their zenith. So the Mediterranean was covered by their fleets. They were masters of Greece and Hungary, and it remained for them, only for them, to conquer the islands of Malta and Cyprus, and then they could throw themselves upon Italy. So they're really a danger at this time. So there was an attempt upon Malta in 1565, and this is the famous siege of Malta. And there we've seen that there are other attacks on the islands before, once even, that the mention of somebody famous in a letter scared them off. Anybody remember who that was? Andrea Doria, Admiral Andrea Doria, he was mentioned in a letter that the false letters were sent to the Turks, somehow planted so that they received them, and then they fell for it, and they decided to not attack the island in order to avoid being, as they thought they would be, attacked by Andrea Doria, who was very successful against them. It was actually a similar ruse that was used during the Second World War that it had to do with the invasion of Italy, that some false letters were actually put on a dead body in Spain. They dropped off the coast of Spain, and the Germans picked it up, and with papers that had the opposite of the Allied plans to invade Italy, and the Germans fell for it. They thought that those were the actual Allied plans, when in reality they were the opposite. They said I forget what exactly places they were, but they said the false paper said, we'll attack one place, pretend like we're going to attack one place, but actually attack another, whereas it was switched around. And they fell for that. So they had this other place all defended, whereas the Allies went and attacked a different place. So the oldest tricks are always the best ones. Okay. Okay, so yes, this is in 1565. Anybody know the name of the Grand Master of as became known later, of the Knights of Malta, St. John Hospitallers, during the siege? Famous person. La Valette. Actually, the capital city of Malta is now called Valletta, named after him. So, famous person, La Valette. Yeah, so if you ever manage to get to Malta and you see a city called Valletta, it's named after him. Yes. This is the Hospitallers, Knights of St. John of the Hospital, otherwise known as the Knights of Malta, because they're so famous for having defended Malta. More than once. Although I've read that the name of the capital of Malta at the time was actually Medina. That was the name of it, which was one of the sacred cities of Islam, is also called Medina. In any case, interesting bit of trivia there. So after a long, very dangerous, very bloody siege, the Turks were finally driven off of Malta. And there was also, again, another famous incident from that whole siege was that the Maltese were involved. They were definitely involved in helping the Knights of St. John defend their island. So at one point, the Turks their camp was in one location. They were attacking the forts that the Knights were manning on the island. and the Maltese attacked from their capital city from the Turkish rear. They came back to their camp and it was all destroyed because of the Maltese. So they wanted to get revenge for that. They went to go and attack the Maltese city, which had no ammunition or anything. But what they did was they put all of these people on their walls. Like, they took anybody who could basically stand, put them in a uniform, or even women. They took women, put them in uniforms on the walls, made the walls look like they were fully manned. And then as the Turks started approaching, they started firing at them, making it look like they had tons of extra ammunition. But that was all they had. They had very few forces, very little ammunition. But the Turks fell for that. So they, oh, fine, we're not going to attack that city. We don't have we can't even deal with the Knights. We're not going to try to start a new siege against a heavily fortified city. But it wasn't. They fell for that. So, ruses of war, they do actually work sometimes very famously. So, you could spend a long time studying the Siege of Malta, but that's very much outside of our scope here. So, long story short, they lost. The Turks had to leave, suffering something like they lost something like a third of their forces with which they attacked. The Knights really gave them a run for their money, and in fact emerged victorious even. The baffled Turks made a descent after that on the island of Cyprus, where they took their revenge by a bloody slaughter of the inhabitants of that island. So they couldn't defeat. They basically tried picking out someone their own size and lost. They went to a place that was less well defended. So I remember St. Pius V is seeing all this happening, and he realizes that maybe they're stopped at Malta, but they're probably not going to be satisfied with Cyprus. So he, St. Pius V makes a very concerted effort to make it clear to the European princes just how great their own danger is, because obviously if the Turks were to overrun Italy, they wouldn't stop there. They wouldn't stop with the Papal States. They would continue on into any place they could get, obviously. Remember, Muslims had been as far as France in the past centuries, even past millennia. So St. Pius V succeeded in effecting a league between the Venetians and Spaniards, to whom he joined all the forces of Italy. So he himself appointed the leader of the expedition, and his choice, of course, decided the victory that, we know in retrospect that this league won. Anybody remember? We've talked about it before, who this was. Yes? Yes. Yes, he ended up being the illegitimate son of who? Of whom? Whose illegitimate son was he? Charles V? Anybody remember? Anybody remember hearing that? So he named St. Pius V as the one who chose Don Juan of Austria to be the leader of the Christian squadron at the Battle of Lepanto. So again, they were joined by the Knights of Malta and the galleys of the Duke of Savoy. And in all their strength, they met the Turkish fleet of 245 galleys and 87 ships of every class in the Gulf of Lepanto in October, specifically October 7th, 1571. So, big date. Very important date. Battle of Lepanto. So the actual fighting lasted 5 hours. And in the heat of the onset, the 2 flagships of each fleet found themselves engaged in close quarters. The Turkish commander on the field in the ship, yes? The capital ship of the fleet, basically. The ship that flies the flag most prominently. The flagship, yes. The Turkish commander, field commander, you might call him, was killed. And his head, which was displayed upon the masts of one of the galleys of the Christian fleet, completed the defeat of his followers. So, yeah, that would be demoralizing. It turns out that 25,000 infidels, Muslims, were slain and 10,000 captured, according to this count. So, St. Pius V, prayed while the battle was going on. Daras making the comparison with Moses. And by the way, that's the reason why the celebrant at Mass stands in this position when saying orations, because Moses was in a similar position while there was one battle between the Israelites, and I don't remember who else it was, but for as long as he had his arms extended, the Israelites won. But if he put them down, they'd start losing. So that's right. So he had to have, in fact, two people help him hold up his arms for the whole battle, so that they would win. But anyway, that's the reason why the celebrant stands like that. So just because of that comparison with Moses, yeah, there you go. Some liturgical notes for you there. So anybody know anything else interesting about the Battle of Lepanto and St. Pius V? We'll get to it in a moment, but it's a famous story, so somebody might know it. No? Okay. Well, as soon as I say no, everybody raises his hand. Okay. Anyway, anybody want to venture a guess at what it was? Yes?
I have a story that they captured the flag of the Ottoman flagship.
Yes, they did.
Yes,
that's true. Yes, Paul VI did want to return that flag. It's true. I think they turned it down. I think the Turkish president, because by that time it was not an empire, it was considered a republic. The Turkish president turned it down, which that kind of makes sense. Why you would want to have a flag returned to you that was captured so many years later, or so many years earlier. But, you want to have your symbol of your own defeat returned to you? I don't know. Anyway, I think he turned it down. But yes, anyway. Paul VI wanted to have that. Paul VI wanted to return it to them. Yeah. But anyway, that's true. But what I'm thinking of specifically, Pius V and Lepanto is what he talks. Daras actually talks about it here, and that is that at the very moment when victory crowned the arms of Don Juan at Lepanto, the sovereign pontiff received a divine revelation of the event. And it was a divine revelation. Again, remember, speed of communications at the time would have taken quite a while for this news to travel to Rome from Lepanto. So he was in the middle of a council with the cardinals when the battle was concluded, and so he suddenly broke it off and said, "This is not the time to talk of business. Let us go and return thanks to God in His temple. Our arms have just been blessed with victory." Yet at the time, there was no way for him to have known that through natural means. Speed of communication at the time simply didn't permit that. So it was only days after that it was known that it was at that very hour that the cross had triumphed in the Gulf of Lepanto. So he received a divine revelation of that event, that fact that the Catholics were victorious. So St. Pius V decreed, in gratitude for that victory, that throughout the Christian world, the Feast of the Rosary should be solemnized every year on the first Sunday of October. And now it's actually, October is fixed to October 7th. It's not just the first, that may fall on the first Sunday of October, but it's now fixed to a date rather than to the first Sunday in October. But that's why if you look in the Antiphonale book, you see that the solemnity of the Holy Rosary is still, at that time, is still first Sunday of October. And he also added to the Litany of the Blessed Virgin, Auxilium Christianorum ora pro nobis. So then, with regard to the internal administration of the Church, in 1566, St. Pius V published the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which had been compiled under the eyes of that council. And so he promulgated that. Saint Charles Borromeo is active at the time. He steadily pursued his course of reformation in the church and religious orders, though often at the peril of his life. In fact, there was an order called the Umiliati, so very humble-sounding name, obviously, but when he strove to bring them back to their primitive regularity, in other words, to bring them back to their primitive observance, they hired a renegade priest to murder him. So, not exactly living up to their religious ideals here. So they don't like an archbishop, so they decide to hire, a renegade priest to himself commit another sacrilege and to murder the archbishop. So this assassin tried to shoot him as he was actually praying at the evening devotions of his household. He was struck by the ball, but miraculously fell harmless at his feet. So basically, it was bounced off of him miraculously. So the response of Pius V was to publish the authors of the crime and abolish the order of the Umiliati altogether. So also with a view to establish liturgical unity throughout the Church, the Council of Trent had ordered the publication of a uniform breviary and missal to be used by every member of the Catholic clergy. And it was on the 9th of July, 1568, that St. Pius V published a constitution abolishing all particular breviaries, so in other words, all and anything that was outside of the Roman Rite, that was less than 200 years old, and ordained that everywhere the form of the office contained in the Roman breviary be used. Again, this is another important date especially for seminarians to keep in mind. See if I can get it right. It's July 9th of 1568. Breviary. And then the missal appeared 2 years later in 1570. So remember, the Council of Trent had ordained that, decreed that these things should be done, but didn't actually do it. The council didn't actually do it itself. So then Pius V, of course, agreeing with that. It's not that a council can bind a pope to do anything, at least with regard to disciplinary things. Of course, a pope is bound to the dogmatic definitions of a council, even if he himself is the one who approves the council. Of course, this is a disciplinary thing. He thinks it's a good idea, so he goes ahead and publishes these universal breviary and missal. He said, so in the bull promulgating the missal, anybody know what the name of that bull is? It's very famous, especially traditional Catholics like to quote it or misquote it, but yes. Yes, quo primum. Yes. In itself, obviously, it's a very good thing, but you hear nowadays, you never hear it all somebody saying that Paul VI didn't cross his T's or dot his I's or something, so he didn't abolish it correctly or something, which is nonsense. If you actually look at it, it's nonsense. But in any case, quo primum, in itself, an excellent document, of course. Publishing the Roman Missal in order that all, he says, may embrace and observe in all places the traditions of the Holy Roman Church, the mother and mistress of all the others. We forbid, henceforth and forever, that the Mass be said or chanted otherwise than is prescribed in the Missal published by our order, except when, in virtue of a primitive institution or of a custom dating farther back than 200 years, certain churches have assiduously observed a particular usage in the manner of celebrating Mass. So one of the reasons he chose specifically 200 years was because, of course, the Dominicans had their own right. He was a Dominican. He didn't want to abolish the Dominican right. So Dominican right managed to slip in there. Yeah, I don't know exactly how much earlier the Dominican right came about, but he did. He allowed the Dominican right to survive. Though the Dominican right, there's no MC. So but a lot of other rights that were older that continued to exist were earlier forms of development of the Roman right. My own theory is that was at the point of development before they discovered just how useful it is to have an MC. So anyway, that's cor primum. We'll continue on with these actually very interesting questions of church discipline next time.